your way out here. Really, really appreciate you taking the time and giving us an opportunity to share some of our past 18 years. It's a little bit incredible, but it's 18 years that we have been working on this, and before that, probably another 10 years that we cannot account for. So it's been my lifetime. So I'm Jose Oberholzer. I'm the coordinator of the Chicago Diabetes Project. I'm not the one who came up with this idea. This is actually another man, and he's sitting here quietly eating his salad and hoping that I'm not going to name him. But actually, Howard Knockinson, many years ago, met me through the dean at the University of Illinois. And he had this idea that the foundation that he's running, the Washington Square Health Foundation, could support a project that would bring scientists together from around the world. And a little bit in analogy to the Manhattan Project, could work together to solve a significant problem. Now, of course, we were not out to create a nuclear bomb. That was done through the Manhattan Project. But we started as the Chicago Project. And then shortly later, we realized that maybe we should add diabetes to it so people would know what we are talking about. And so it turned into the Chicago Diabetes Project. And so the promise was that if we can convince enough scientists to share their knowledge and to work together and put their egos down and essentially work as a technician for the greater good of a project, that maybe we could progress much faster than if people compete and are working in different silos. And so that has been the promise of the Chicago Diabetes Project. Now you're going to say, well, why another project? Why another foundation? There's the Juvenile Diabetes Foundations, there's the American Diabetes Association, there's the National Institute of Health, and all those organizations that are funding research in diabetes. And so the role of the Chicago Diabetes Project was never to substitute any of those, but to complement them. And hopefully, throughout my presentation, you're going to understand that we have this very important role to support when others cannot support or are just not nimble enough to support them. So the vast majority of work that we are going to see was actually funded either through the National Institute of Health, the American Diabetes Association, JDRF, and so on. And we were just funding additional work that put people together and that forced some of the groups to maybe think of a different path, and maybe a faster path. I'm going to say, well, 18 years was not particularly fast, but in the world that I am working, unfortunately, everything takes a lot of time. And the rule is always, it never turns out the way you hoped for, and in particular, never turns out the way you thought it would. So there's always something happening. And that's just the nature of biology, but it's also the nature of clinical trials and trying to treat diseases in a different way. So over the next 45 minutes, I just would like to address a few points. First of all, I want to give you an update on what islet cell transplantation can do today and what that is, and to put that into the context of the latest development in diabetes technology. And I'm fully aware that most of you are either directly touched by diabetes or through family members, so you're all pretty knowledgeable. I'm just going to reiterate a few things for those who are maybe a little bit less familiar with the concepts. And then talk about what's next, because there are some serious limitations with islet cell transplantation, as you're going to see. And so those are going to be essentially finding insulin-producing cells that we can reproduce and transplant them without having to use anti-rejection medication, because that's what we have to do today, and you'll hear more about it. And last but not least, I would like to then invite Childine. Childine and Patsydine are here, and they are running the Chicago Diabetes Project from an administrative point of view. And so Jill is then going to share some of the fundraising activity in 2022. And I also would like to thank beforehand Jenny Cook, who is there. Without her, nothing. So back to the basics. So type 1 diabetes, what is that exactly? we, to be honest, actually don't know exactly what it is. We know what happens, but we don't know why, and we don't know exactly how this all evolves. But essentially, we have the pancreas. In the pancreas, there are insulin-producing cells, and they are all agglomerated in little islands, or we call them islets, by the name of the doctor who discovered that, Langerhans, so the islets of Langerhans. And in those islets, there are insulin-producing cells. We also call them beta cells, and they essentially secrete insulin into the bloodstream very, very much in concert with how high the blood sugar is. The more we eat and the more blood sugar goes up, the more insulin produced. The lower the blood sugar, the less insulin is produced. And it keeps the blood sugar in a quite steady range. Now in type 1 diabetes, those insulin-producing cells are destroyed. And why they are destroyed, there are millions of different theories, but we really don't know exactly why that happens. We know that it's not that uncommon. About 1.4, 1.5 million type 1 diabetic patients in the US alone. And for now, there is no approved method to cure type 1 diabetes. It's just something that when you get diagnosed with, you are being told essentially that's what you're going to have for the rest of your life. Now, luckily, there is a treatment for that, and that treatment has been around for a little bit over 100 years now. So the patients inject insulin, and for that, they need to learn how to eat correctly, how to anticipate by how much their blood sugar will increase, how much insulin they need to inject, and there are many, many variables that impact all that. And so I can summarize a little bit the historical limitations when patients only had like certain ways of injecting insulin and certain ways of measuring glucose level, is that if you wanted to control your blood sugars really tight, and you're going to hear that number quite a few times, hemoglobin A1C, so that measures how much sugar is on your red blood cells, on the hemoglobin, and that reflects the blood sugar over the last 3 months, more or less. So if you want that value to be low, so that the blood sugar on average is low, you inject more insulin. But as you do that, and you see this, let me see whether I can create a pointer here. You see this here. As you lower your blood sugar reflected by the hemoglobin A1C, the glycosylated hemoglobin, you'll reduce the risk of complications. And here it's just reflected as the eye disease, retinopathy. But as you try to control your blood sugars tighter, you will encounter one of the side effects of insulin, which is having lows when your blood sugar goes really low. And if you have that too often, your brain gets used to really low blood sugars, and over time, you lose the warning symptoms of going low. I'm not diabetic. If I go low, I get hangry. You know that feeling. Well, long-standing type 1 diabetic patients who have the bad luck to develop that unawareness don't have that anymore. They can be in front of you, have a blood sugar of 35, and be completely functional, and then shortly afterwards they just pass out. And so that's the crux of insulin therapy. Now, luckily, I can now say this is historical because technology has advanced enormously, and today we have tools at hand that we wouldn't have dared to dream about just 15 years ago. So now we have sensors that measure every few minutes, measure the blood sugar level, or actually the glucose level in the subcutaneous tissue. And then there is a computer that speaks to the pump using a mathematical algorithm, tells the pump exactly how much insulin the patient probably needs. And I can summarize the results of all this technology is that most patients can now achieve a hemoglobin A1C somewhere around 7.5%, or maybe even a little bit lower. Normal would be 6. But once you get to 7, the risk of having complications goes quite dramatically down. And most patients can avoid severe hypoglycemia with that, although some patients will still have some severe episodes. And most patients will have less than 1 or 2% of time being in the range that we call hypoglycemia. So it's not 0, it's not perfect, but it's a dramatic change for the patients. Now, of course, I say that as a doctor. And if you ask patients, they will say, well, the experience is much improved, but some patients say, well, welcome to type 1 diabetes, where every day is like a science experiment, because life gets in the way. And the machine really tries to anticipate as much as possible, but it can't do it all the time. In addition, it's a machine, and the tubing got kinked, the insulin may be not the best that day, the sensor may falls off, but there are all kinds of technical limitations. But overall, it's very clear that this has changed the life of type 1 diabetic patients and their parents. Now, for those who have the bad luck of developing this severe unawareness of flows, it can be extremely frustrating to control the blood sugars. And then what happens is some of the patients don't dare to wear the pumps anymore, and they want to inject themselves because then they can run themselves higher to avoid that the blood sugars will go too low. And that, of course, has long-term consequences. So overall, it's probably fair to say that among the 1.5 million type 1 diabetic patients, over 90% are probably doing pretty well with the current technology. But by saying that, I also have to acknowledge that the statistics show that only about 1 in 4 patients will really reach the goal where we want to be. So 75% of patients in the US with type 1 diabetes do not reach the goals that we are aiming for as physicians and nurses and so on. So there is unfortunately a group of patients in whom we completely fail, and those are what I would call brittle type 1 diabetic patients. This is a very controversial expression. Most endocrinologists get mad at me when I use it, but my patients tell me, please keep on using it because that's what I feel like. I'm a brittle type 1 diabetic patient. And what that means is these are patients that have very high swings and just don't feel when they are going low. They just feel, they do not feel anymore where the blood sugars is. And so for that small group of patients, we can offer today islet cell transplantation. We still do very rare occasion pancreas transplants, and I'm happy to discuss that after the presentation when that will be the case. But for most patients, it's more attractive to have a simple injection, and I'm going to explain how that works, and just have the insulin-producing cells rather than the entire organ, which is a complicated surgery. So for those who are not familiar with islet cell transplantation, so we still need an organ. So we are limited by the number of organ donors. The organ is then brought to a special laboratory, a clean room facility, where it's put into a chamber and digested. So we inject an enzyme into the organ that will break down the tissue and free up the islets. And the islets are then collected and purified based on the density, so that's the weight. The islets are lighter than the rest of the organ, and we can purify the cells in this way. Once that is completed, and we know that we have enough cells for a patient, the patient is being called in. In the meantime, the islets are in culture, and then we put them into infusion bags or syringes, and then they are infused into the patient's liver in local anesthesia. So we talk to the patient is awake in the radiology suite, and the interventional radiologist will place a catheter for us, and then we infuse those cells, and the cells then settle in the small veins of the liver. So for that, you need a clean room facility, and we are lucky enough that in Chicago at the University of Illinois, there's a beautiful clean room facility that was built for this. And we have a joint venture between the University of Illinois and a small startup company that came out of the Chicago Diabetes Project, CellTrans, that is pursuing all the regulatory work for the university. Now you're going to ask, well, why is there a private company involved in this? And it has to do with the statute of the University of Illinois that is a public land grant university that for liability reasons cannot take on the manufacturing of a product. So the University of Illinois in 2015 asked us to create a company that would essentially do what we are doing inside the same facilities, but will provide a liability shield as a C corporation. And so in 2016, CellTrans was formed with the sole purpose of providing islets to the University of Illinois, and then hopefully later on also to other universities and hospitals. So there is a regulatory path that we have to go through because islet cell transplantation is by the FDA considered a biological drug. So it's not a transplant. And so we had to go through phase 1, 2, and 3 trial, licensure trial, and we will see where we are at this in a second. So this is how it's being done. So we have an interventional radiologist. My role as a transplant surgeon is diminished to holding up a bag. And Amy laughs because she knows that I went 6 years to medical school, 6 years of surgical training, specialty training in transplantation. So at the end, I can hold up a bag. My father always said, great. And so at that time, we were at least using syringes, so I had at least the pressure of pushing the syringe. Today, it's a bag. So this is how it looks in the radiology suite. You see a catheter inserted into the liver through the skin, and then the cells are infused here, and you see all those little ramifications. They are being blocked by the cells. And the reason the liver tolerates that is that the liver also has an artery going in, and so then the artery just compensates for the little bit of reduction in blood flow from the portal vein. And I know this looks a little bit like an infomercial, but visuals can say 1,000 words. That's how most patients will look before transplantation. These are 2 different trials we did. This is just randomly this group. The second trial was a little bit less well controlled before transplant, but both groups after transplantation look very similar. That is the control you get, and that's without using insulin. So those patients on this graph were taken off insulin. Now, this is at 1 year, and how does it look over the long term? Again, this number, the hemoglobin A1C, which reflects the blood sugar of the last 3 months. We aim, because it's a transplant and we take risks, we aim lower than what we would aim for insulin. We want to be below 6.5% ideally. And you see that most patients will achieve that for many years after the transplant. Now, it is a transplant, and as such, the success rate is probably never going to be 100%, because it's always the risk of rejection, like it would happen in a kidney transplant or heart transplant. So that's something that needs to be monitored for a really long time afterwards. So in terms of patients being able to stop insulin, am I activating Siri? Sorry for that. So please turn off your Siri. I seem to trigger Siri. So the insulin dependence rate is somewhere around 50 to 60% in the long term. At the beginning, it's a bit higher, but then some patients over time can lose some of the islets with the current technology and medications we are using. The goal, of course, is that those patients don't have any more severe hypoglycemic episodes. So we don't want them to go low, and we want them to also be in that range that prevents complications from happening over the long term. And that's achieved in the vast majority of patients. Now, in terms of on the very long term, 10 years and beyond, of course, there is still much work to be done. So most patients over the years, once the 10 years are over, will slowly lose the islet graft function. Now, of course, there are patients who are much further out than that, 16, 17 years, and where the islets are still kicking and functioning. And of course, as progress goes on and as we have more experience with the treatment of the patients, that's going to be hopefully the vast majority of patients. As I said, there is a regulatory path, and we have been working on this for many, many years. Howard has stopped counting the years just to make it more bearable. And so last year, we were fortunate enough that the FDA finally convened an advisory committee, and the advisory committee voted in favor of approving islet cell transplantation. Now, I wish that I could tell you that that translated into the FDA actually approving it, which they should have done on August of last year. But unfortunately, they came back with a whole list of things that they wanted us to do in addition in the manufacturing process. You have to realize that all this work was done in academia, and the FDA has just a very different standard between academia and the corporate world. There is a big, big difference. And so I do not want to criticize the FDA other than for the pain they inflicted to all of us. But they have a point. And the one point is that at the end of the day, this needs to be absolutely safe and reproducible, and it should work pretty much in every patient equally. Now, we are never going to achieve that because the organ donors are all a little bit different. But we have to aim for this to be as close to a drug as possible. And so we'll, at the end, Jill will share with you just a slide. I don't want to tell too much about this, and you'll understand what I mean by making things more stable and more reproducible, and I think we have achieved that. So the timeline now is, we have done everything they have asked us. We will submit everything by December of this year. Then the FDA has 6 months, and because I'm from Switzerland and by nature a pessimist, I didn't write May here, but August. So hopefully by August of next year, we should have final approval. From then on, islet cell transplantation, at least for those who really are in trouble, could be offered. And we have a little bit of work to do with the insurance companies, but we are very optimistic that once the FDA approves, the insurance companies will approve that. And so patients can have this then as standard of care. And yes, it would have taken us 19 years to get there. So for now, actually, the FDA has given us what we call expanded access. It used to be compassionate use, was a name. Expanded access essentially means that legally we can do it. And unfortunately, the insurance companies for now are not paying for the procedure, but somehow they are keeping one eye closed and one ear closed. They are paying for the medications. Knock on wood so far. And they're paying for the follow-up. They're just not paying for the actual procedure, and so that's where the Chicago Diabetes Project has been jumping in and given a grant to the University of Illinois to cover at least the procedure costs. And the University of Illinois has been extremely generous in really just charging what it really costs without markups or anything like that. So once this is approved, we would estimate that about 1,000 patients a year could have that. Of course, that's far, far away from what the actual need is. But don't forget that we are limited by the number of organs. And so this is not going to be a widely available procedure until we have a different source of cells. I'm going to talk about this in a minute. And then also don't forget that those patients still have to take anti-rejection medications. So for the patients that are enrolled in our trial, I would say most over time tolerate it well, but it's always something that patients will have to struggle with and will need expert follow-up. And so as long as that's the case, we are very reluctant, for example, to transplant children. So for now, we are not doing that because those medications will have to be taken for many, many years to come. Of course, if you ask the patients that are successful and that are out for many, many years, they just like say it's not that big of a deal. But I do think it is a big deal because you have to have the tolerance to it. Not every patient tolerates it. And I think the most important part is you're always going to be bound to somebody who knows how to handle those medications, and that not every physician knows how to do that. So now, how are we going to address the cell source? Instead of using organ donors, what else can we do? So one thing that we are pursuing, and I'm not going to talk too much about this for now, is that the cells that we have, we can push them into growing. That has been exceedingly difficult, but as this goes, baby steps are being made, and so at least in the Petri dish at small scale, we can make them grow, but we are still very far away from using that in the clinic. The more commonly used approach nowadays is to take stem cells, mostly adult, inducible pluripotent stem cells. So this essentially, you take a little biopsy even from your mouse mucosa, you can transform those cells into stem cells, and then you can push those stem cells into becoming insulin-producing cells. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And then the other part is to say that, well, if in the past we were able to use pig insulin, which was used for decades as the standard insulin, then why not use pig islets? Because if we can eat the steak from a pig, we may be able to use islets for medical use. So the ethics and the morality behind that is probably accepted by most. The only problem is that the rejection to animal tissue is very vigorous. And then there are, of course, infectious risks, because animals may have certain germs that we don't have, and that could cause trouble. So all this is being investigated and addressed, and there are some really serious efforts to bring this towards the clinic, and that's going to happen. So I know from several groups that this is going to happen. I'm not going to give timelines anymore because they have been wrong consistently, but it's going to happen. So what is the Chicago Diabetes Project supporting in the stem cell field? So as a foundation, we have the ability to give grants, but we also have the ability, like the Juvenile Diabetes Foundation is doing, to do what is called program-related investments. And so we have one little program-related investment into Trailhead Biosystems. It's a startup company that also came out of the Chicago Diabetes Project with the group at the Cleveland Clinic and Case Western University in Cleveland. And Jan Jensen, who is very familiar to those who have been here for many years, took the risk to leave academia and start Trailhead Biosystems. Essentially what they are doing is they are creating stem cells at an industrial level. So you're going to see one of the issues that the stem cell field has is that it's very difficult to reproduce every time to have the right insulin-producing cells. And so they are using very advanced robotics technology to standardize that. And we are only a very small supporter of them. The biggest supporter is Army, which is a federal project to create cell manufacturing facilities in the US, because the federal government realized a few years back that through all the politics of stem cells and so on, the US got way behind the rest of the world. And so they made a major investment into this Army project, and this company, Trailhead Biosystems, is supported by them. So their role will be essentially to create stem cell-derived islets at a low cost, at levels that could be really used in millions of patients. The other part that the Chicago Diabetes Project has been supporting is infrastructure to assess the cells. So because we know how a normal human islet looks, over the years we became experts in their function and knowing exactly what a normal islet needs to look like. And the stem cell people often don't have that knowledge. And so over the years, with support of the Juvenile Diabetes Foundation, we were able to create chips, biochips, where we can put those cells and essentially under the microscope visualize how the cells work. And so this is something that the CDP is now supporting after JDRF supported this for a long time. And this allows us to help other groups. And I'm not going to go into too much detail, but essentially when somebody has an idea, for example, how to convert an other islet cell into an insulin-producing cell, we were able to tell them whether this really works or not. Or if somebody was cloning cells, we were able to tell them how those cloned cells were working. Or in the stem cell field, we were able to help. Now one group I want to highlight particularly, because they made it into the clinic, is the group of Doug Melton at the Harvard Stem Cell Institute. And so the Chicago Diabetes Project had created an infrastructure to test cells also in animal models and with those biochips. And very early on, when Doug Melton was producing the first insulin-producing cells from stem cells, very quickly we were able to help them. And when I say very quickly, I met Doug Melton in January. This must have been 2000, when was the paper out? Probably 2011 or something like that. And in March of that year, we did the first experiment. Wow. If we had gone through normal funding mechanism, it would have been 1 or 2 years. And that was the strength of the Chicago Diabetes Project, that we could say, okay, this is important, let's do it right away. And then they published this absolutely seminal paper, which really revolutionized the entire field. And then later on, started a company with the name of Semma that got acquired later on by Vertex. And maybe some of you saw in the New York Times of pretty much a year ago, November 27, 21, where Vertex had transplanted the first patient with stem cell-derived islets under immunosuppression. So very similar to what we do with islets, but with cells that were created in the lab. And so this is Felicia Paluca and Doug Melton, who also had the courage to leave academia and start that company. And so they are now on a path to further develop that. Unfortunately, the second and the third patient that did is not working quite as well. And so it just shows that there's a proof of concept, which is enormously important, but we are not quite there yet. And I'll get back to that. But again, we, as a very small organization, have a huge role in this. And I think this is a really, really good example why organizations like ours are important. We are small but nimble and can act very quickly. So the stem cell field will go on, and we will surely have several sources of insulin-producing cells, but for now we still need immunosuppression. So how are we going to avoid immunosuppression? And so the concept that we are pursuing is to put a shell around the cells. Others are pursuing manipulations of the immune system, like to make the immune system not recognize those cells, but this is very complicated. So being a surgeon, I'm more mechanical. I thought, well, why not just put the shell around those cells and try to prevent rejection? And so there are two concepts, and we are focusing on one. So we are focusing on putting a shell around a small amount of islet cells. So this is called microencapsulation. And then mostly industry is focusing on devices that are being implanted with the cells inside, and that can be retrieved. Maybe some of you heard the Biocide trial in California. They use the device like that. We do not think that those devices can work, and so far they have not worked in clinical trials. They are too big, and the diffusion distance, or the distance that oxygen and nutrients have to travel, is too big to load enough cells in there. And that was the problem that Biocide encountered. So we focus on the microencapsulation. And so what have we been supporting in this field? So first of all, we started kind of at a very high level because we had the opportunity to support the clinical trial at the University of Perugia quite a few years back. And the way we supported this is that we provided them cells that we isolated and that we were allowed to ship to Italy when we didn't have a suitable patient in the US. And so we supported them in the context of this trial, and I apologize, this is very small, but I just want to give you the granular data, what did really happen to those patients. And you can see here that what we measure in those patients is, can they produce their own insulin? For that to do, because how do we differentiate the insulin that we inject from the insulin that the patient produced? We can measure a small peptide, it's called the C-peptide, that is always part of the insulin being secreted, and we do not inject that. So all those patients had no C-peptide before the transplant, and then they start producing C-peptide even 3 years after the transplant. But unfortunately, none of the patients really could stop taking insulin. So you see the amount of insulin that they were taking before the transplant, and it does come down somewhat, but not very impressively. While they were reducing their insulin, also their hemoglobin A1C came down, meaning the blood sugars were better controlled. But this was just not the whole deal. That's not what we wanted. We wanted those patients to be cured, but we didn't cure them. So why did this not quite work the way we hoped for? And so this was not so easy to answer, but it happened at more or less at the same time. There was a group in Australia that tried the same thing, but with a different capsule material. And then they had the ability to go back to those patients and actually look inside where they had put the capsule. They put the capsule in the abdominal cavity. And so they did a laparoscopy, went in with a camera, and they saw that all those capsules had completely scarred down. And they were able to retrieve some of them, and you see this huge layer of tissue around the capsule. That's really bad. That's called a foreign body reaction. And that impedes any oxygen or nutrients to actually get to the cells. And so we knew, well, we need to look at that. Initially, we thought maybe shipping the cells to Italy is a problem. Maybe the cells were not good enough. So we went to the FDA and we asked the FDA, can we do this trial in the US? And the group from Italy came actually to the US and reproduced everything in Chicago. But then the FDA said, well, your data is not strong enough. We want you to test this in more animal models. And one of them was unfortunately a non-human primate model. So we had never done that. So we had to establish that model at the University of Illinois and then put the capsules in. And thankfully, we actually did that. I was very upset initially when we were asked to do that because it's very costly and difficult. But we realized that the capsules that we had put in at the University of Perugia provoked a massive foreign body reaction. And then we went on to test all the other materials that were available, and every material was doing that. So we knew that we had a really significant problem that we had to prevent. This is all massive inflammation around the capsule. There's no way that the cell can survive in there. So we knew that we had a problem. And so we started a journey that took us about 15 years to understand what does provoke this foreign body reaction, and is there any way to prevent this? And so I'm going to fast forward 15 years and just show off a little bit with some front page articles in really good journals. And I'm going to very quickly just go through some of the principles that we investigated. So all this work was done in collaboration between the University of Illinois, a Polymer Science Institute in Slovakia, the Harvard Stem Cell Institute, MIT, and the university in Norway in Trondheim. So we looked at the size, we looked at the shape, and we realized that this is really important, that there is some sweet spot of size of capsule where we have the least foreign body reaction, but then also where the cells are still able to work. And I promise you this will be the only graph that I'm going to show you, but I'm showing you this because this question comes up every time we talk about the capsule. And the question is, well, if there is a capsule around the cells, are the cells still going to be able to recognize the blood sugar quick enough? And is the insulin going to come out quick enough? And so to answer that question, we used those biochips that I showed you, and we put capsules of different sizes and naked cells in there, and perfused the cells, so put glucose-rich solution around the cells, and then measured over time how much insulin they release. And so you see a normal eye that has like this peak, and then a second peak. And that's important to keep your blood sugar low when you eat, that you're not going high. But what ultimately determines how well your blood sugar comes down after a meal is what we call the area under the curve. So everything underneath is calculated. And you see that the area of the curve, on the curve, is very similar, not significantly different, between a naked islet, a small capsule, or a large capsule. But what we do know is that we are going to lose that little peak. And we won't be able to answer this until we are in clinical trials, whether this is going to be a problem or not. We know that the total amount of insulin secreted should be enough to prevent the patients from going high. The other thing we did is we did a huge screen. We had a chemist at MIT for 6 years, completing 50,000 different syntheses of molecules, and tested that over a 10-year period until we found a small group of molecules that was able to prevent the foreign body reaction. And for a number of reasons, that was the best hit. So everything that is white is a bit scarce. You see it's not perfect, but it was the chemical that was best tolerated by the islets, and we called it RCA15, and you will see that in a little bit. We also made the proof of concept that if we encapsulate stem cell-derived islets, that it still can work. And we were able to show this in animals by keeping their blood sugars constant over months without giving any immunosuppression. And you have to realize this is human tissue in a mouse that would normally get rejected within 5 to 7 days. The capsules were able to prevent rejection for a long time. And then last but not least, we put everything together that we had learned. And then we were able for the first time in a non-human primate, in a diabetic monkey, to do this transplant in a place that had never been done before, in the, what we call the fat pad omentum. And we were able to keep those cells alive for more than 6 months without using any immunosuppression. And just for you to understand what this picture actually means, so this is a space behind the stomach where the capsules will lie in a nice layer, whereas if you just put them in the capsule like we did, in the cavity like we did in Italy, all the capsules just went down to the lowest part, and the cells could not survive. A mouse is different. A mouse walks like this, so the capsules were always okay in mice. But once we went to an upright animal, unfortunately by gravity the capsules were down. So we had to find the space. And so the way this is going to be done in patients, and I apologize for the one surgical video, is it's a simple laparoscopy, so 2 very little cuts. We lift up the stomach and make this little hole in the fat pad, and then introduce a catheter where we apply the cells. And you will see in a second that they go behind the stomach and the animal is put a little bit upright, and then they will slide down into this space. And you will see that the capsules distribute very nicely and are not being clumped. So you'll see in a second those little beads in that layer behind. And so that's where the cells then make the insulin, and the blood from that area goes directly to the liver, which is the target organ for insulin. And then we go back here, just an example of 4 weeks later, but the same is 6 months later. You see that those capsules have not provoked any inflammation. There's no redness, there's no scars, and we can flush the capsules around. They're not adherent, and the cells are still fully viable and fully functional. So, since these experiments happened, we have been working very hard on translating this now to the next stage. And so if I can summarize what our current tactic is that, yeah, we want to continue to do islet cell transplant for those who really need it with immunosuppression. But at the second point is that we want to transplant now cadaver islets and encapsulate them so that we don't have to give immunosuppression. And then by the time that we are done with all that, I'm pretty confident that the stem cell field will have advanced enough that we will have reproducible stem cell-derived islets to combine the capsules with the stem cells. So currently, what we are focusing on is to continue to do the islet isolations at the University of Illinois, and then translate all this laboratory-based biomaterial science into something that would be safe to go into patients. And that's taking a little bit more time than I had wished for. There is luckily a pretty well-described path by the FDA that we are pursuing. Part of that will also be toxicology testing, making sure that those materials don't have any unexpected side effects in the patients. We do not want to have any surprises that it could cause some sort of cancer or any other unwanted effects. And we are working on the regulatory filings. This will be a combined investigation in new drug application and what is called the device exemption. That's what you have to do in the device world, because using the capsule is going to be, by definition, a device. So we'll have all the complications that the FDA has on the table. So if I may conclude, I think despite the long time this is all taking, we have remained very, very focused on this one topic. We have not been sidetracked by any new waves or science or by any new directions. We know that things take time and that we have to persevere. I'm very proud to say that now we can give islet cell transplantation, at least under expanded access, and hopefully very soon a standard of care. And also to know that the renewable cell sources is not just anymore a theory. It has been used in patients, and that's going to continue to progress. So our focus remains on bringing encapsulation to the clinic, to not give any more immunosuppression, and we do this as quickly as humanly possible. Now I may ask Jill to come up and just say a few words about the fundraising that we are doing, and then I'll come back with a closing remark, and then maybe ask Amy to say a few words. Okay, good.
Okay, thank you all so much for coming. We're so happy to have you all here. I've talked to, I think, probably pretty much everyone in this room, either by phone or email, so it's nice to meet everybody in person, and we're so glad you can make it all. So for our fundraising for 2022, we did several events. A new one that we had was Puck Diabetes, which is a teensy bit inappropriate of a title, but that's what my 13-year-old came up with, so that is done. And everybody had a grand old time. So for that we did, we had a fundraiser at our ice rink that both my kids skate at on the south side of Chicago, and had a great number of people come out, lots of new families with kids with type 1 who play hockey as well, and we were able to raise just under $11,000 for that. For the we did the 101 challenge again in May. I think this was our 5th year doing it, where we have people just log their miles for the month of May to get to 101 miles, and people raise money for that, and it's create teams, and you know, that was another successful year, raising $8,000 for that. And then Patsy heads the Southside Fights for Diabetes baseball tournament, which is always a huge success, and that is was again in July and August, and we'll do that again next year, and made $46,000 on that, and that's always a huge. Thank you, Kathy and Mike, for everything they do for that. And then every year we have the Chicago and New York marathons. The New York Marathon, which Dr. Oberholzer will be running on Sunday, for the like 7th time, I think.
14th.
14th.
Jeez Louise.
So we will have that, and Joe Broad, who has run how many times now?
9.
9. Thanks to Joe Broad for making and we raised very close to $100,000 for that, just $97,000. And I think donations are actually still coming in for that with some corporate matching. And then we were lucky enough to receive some private gifts this year, over $1 million, which was hugely amazing in helping to continue our research and our focus. So, on to the next slide. So the 4 programs that we use, or the biggest program expenses that we have are at Rice University, which is spending $13,973, and that is assisting with quotes for encapsulated material for phase 1 and phase 2 clinical trials. The Norwegian University of Science and Technology, that is additional materials that are being used, spending about $71,000. For UIC endocrinology, that is where we do screening for new patients and managing the database and registry for that project. And then the UIH islet cell transplant and extended follow-up, spending $115,000. And we were able to do 2 islet cell transplants this summer. And both of those patients are currently off insulin. One has been, one went off insulin after 23 days, the other after 2 months. And these are both of the patients, their A1Cs, which are both, as you can see, oh no, that was the insulin, sorry. This is the A1C, and as you can see, and those that know A1Cs very well, which probably many of you do, you can see that their A1Cs are in normal range, and after the transplants that they received this summer. So lots of good things coming. So, are you coming to that? Okay. Thank you.
So I would like to thank so very much a lot of people, and I know that there are many, many more who should be on this list, but first of all, Howard Knoxon, you changed the life of quite a lot of people around the globe. You did. It's been a pretty amazing journey. You have refocused a lot of scientists. I mentioned Jan Jensen. Jan Jensen was a mouse researcher doing developmental biology, and he's now running a company that produces human cells. He would never have done this without the Chicago Diabetes Project. And the Washington Square Health Foundation, that really has been a catalyst to this. And I think it has been super interesting to see that when you have a focus, you can actually achieve things. And Washington Square Health Foundation focus was to be a catalyst. And that's what they do. They start, they ignite. And for us, the ignition has been really long. Yeah, I appreciate that you keep on igniting. So thank you very much. And then the Christopher family, they have been a huge support to us. The Portillo family, who does not know Portillo's hot dog, and they have been supporting us for many, many years. Unfortunately, they could not attend this evening. Mr. Portillo had some health issues and unfortunately couldn't come. And the Farmer family, Leslie, thank you so very much. And then, I was hesitant to put the Dine family, and I thought that doesn't quite reflect it. So I said the Dine dynasty. We have many Dines here, and it's amazing. You can recognize them by their voice. Somehow they have all the same voice, and it's a very impressive one. And then second, you can recognize them by their heart. They have just an enormous heart and have been behind the Chicago Diabetes Project in every single thing that they can do. So thank you very much. And the Epperson family was also instrumental to support the Chicago Diabetes Project, and it was only through the Washington Square Health Foundation that we got this opportunity. The same with the Warts family that has been supporting us for many years, and many, many other families and private foundations, NIH, ADH, ADRF, and then last but not least, of course, Jennifer Cook, who keeps everything together. We do drive each other crazy from here and there, but she keeps it together. And then last but not least, the biggest thanks goes to all our clinical trial patients for their courage, perseverance, and also friendship over the years. You have to realize that we are aging together. It's been now many years that some of those patients are in our follow-up, and they just never give up. And then, of course, all the numerous researchers around the world who believe in this collaborative manner. Without them, of course, none of this would be possible. Now, I would like to ask two additional guests to come up. So first of all, maybe John, if you wouldn't mind to show your voice and heart, and just maybe share what you feel about this and why you are part of this.
Absolutely. Thank you. I have one of the unique voices of the Dines, as he pointed out. The good part about that is when you get in trouble at home, you can call your mom and tell her you're somebody else. Find out how much trouble you're actually in. So, but this is incredible to be here. It's incredible to see this crowd, and I think a huge thank you goes to you, Dr. Jose. You're an incredible human being. And I think one of the biggest things is how humble you are. It's hard to talk about. I usually get choked up. October 4th, 2011, our little guy, 2 years old, had lost about half his body weight in about 10 days. Some of you here know exactly what I'm talking about. Some of you here are probably wondering what the hell is going on there. He was diagnosed with diabetes, and that set off two different worlds. One was, let's keep him safe, let's keep him healthy. The other side was, let's cure this. Like, my dad gave me some words of wisdom real quick the night at the hospital. Quit whining, you don't have it, fix it. That's it. No emotion, just get to it. So, got to it, and boy, we looked. Took us down a lot of paths. And I went through a lot of different things, functions, walks, you name it. The story never changed. It literally never changed. You talk about how much money is being raised, but nothing ever changed. And then we jumped on a bus.
Yeah, I told Joe this story earlier.
Yeah, we jumped on a bus because we heard some guy, this guy, was speaking down at a bar in Bucktown. So we're thinking, all right, nothing else, we could use a few beers. Go down there and just,
I do not spend my life in bars.
At least one of us. And we heard him speak. And we were a few years into this, and it was all of a sudden an eye-opener, like, this is real. And there were people there that have been cured. Literally have been cured. They no longer take insulin. There's people here today that are that way. And we hear all the science, and forgive me, it goes over my head, and I listen to this a lot more than many of you. And at times you look at it, you think you're so far off. But if you remember what Dr. Jose said, 100 years we've been dealing with insulin. The world somehow accepted that that's a cure. That is a roadmap to get us to a cure. So you talk about 18 years and you're frustrated with it, which I commend you for being frustrated. But in the reality, that is a very small period of time. You've taken it to, the idea of getting cells, putting them in people's body, getting them off insulin, and making them safe, and you've done it. And that's what this project is about. It's about the nimbleness to actually be active. Put the money where it can actually go to work. So it's not just about, hey, let's go cure it. It's about finding the research organizations that can do it. And so we have gone and helped the cell source. That was a huge hurdle. The first couple times we met, you talked about, that was going to be this huge hurdle down the road. Well, we're there. Then it was, we got to put it in there, and we got to worry about the anti-rejections. Well, people are living with the anti-rejections, and it doesn't suck. However, you talk about the encapsulation, and we're there. Now we're looking to put it all together. So that's what the main focus here tonight. If you have a takeaway, the real focus tonight and where we put the money, the numbers that were up there to me are astonishing. The people in this room, many of you have put, whether it's miles on your life, running marathons and these, whether it's literally writing a $20 check or a $200,000 or a $500,000 check. They're all super meaningful because literally when Jill went through those numbers, it's down to the penny. This isn't a wasteful organization. Literally every penny that we get goes to research. And every penny we get, we know exactly where it goes and the meaning behind it. There's a thought process behind every single penny that we get and where it's going. So it's super, super meaningful, and I can't underestimate how thankful we are to everyone in this room, whether it's from Jill and I or from the CDP being on the board. I've never been so proud to be a part of something that I know will work. And then we will throw a party somewhere, probably not here. It's not to hold the people, but we will throw a party that'll be so grand because we will see a cure for many of you in your life and for my kids' life as well. So.
Now there is one more special person. Amy, thank you so much for all the years of being the best patient ever. Equally with you, Ken. And Stephen. Sorry, I'm not ranking patients here, but you have just been an amazing patient, just always precise and always, going through everything without a single complaint. And now you're even serving on the board of the Chicago Diabetes Project. And yeah, just wanted to have you say a few words to the crowd. Thank you. I also want to thank Melissa, her partners for many, many years. They have been many times in the clinic and in a moment that were difficult. Also, thank you very much for all the support.
I'm a crier. I just want to say that. I'm already crying. So 17 years ago, I contacted Joan Martellotto. I don't know if some of you all know her. Some know she's retired.
She was an angel sent from heaven. She was the best nurse practitioner on earth.
She was a great patient advocate. And she just kept bugging me and bugging me and bugging me until I signed up to be a transplant patient. And so I did, and I had my transplant in 2006. I was diagnosed with diabetes when I was 9, and I was 36 years old. And it was 16 years ago, and I'm still off insulin. When I hit 10 years, actually, there's no guarantees. They didn't give me a guarantee that I knew last year, 3 years. They said they didn't know. And when I hit like 3 years, I was like, when I hit 11, I was like, I have to hit 15. And now I've hit 16, so I hope you guys are willing to put up with me for another 4 because I want to hit 20. It really wanted me to talk about how having a transplant has affected my life. And for me, that's a really hard thing to come up with because it's just normal. I don't know how else to describe it. Anybody that has diabetes knows, or has a child with diabetes, or knows someone with diabetes, knows it's like 24 hours, every day, all day, you're constantly thinking about diabetes, how to manage it, what to do, and it's gone. It's not there. I don't think about it. I mean, I think about it because diabetes was my life up until I had my transplant, and now this is it. It's just, I don't know how else to describe it. But like, I guess there's a peace to knowing that when I go to bed, I won't wake up with EMS at the end of my bed trying to wake me up, or having to use glucagon and just, sorry, we're in a restaurant, but just puking everywhere because glucagon made me so sick every time I used it. Still makes me sick, but I don't. And they torture me for all the
You
testing
do a
and
test
stuff.
that's very useful.
Well, I wouldn't be here. Honest to God, I don't think I'd be here. I don't think I'd still be here today if I hadn't had the transplant. I had, before my transplant, I had 25 eye surgeries. And I was told I'd be blind by the time I was 40. I'm 52. And my eye doctor tells me today that if he looked in my eyes without seeing the scar tissue from all the laser surgeries I had, that he would have not had diabetes. And that wasn't why I had the transplant. That's not why I signed up for it. I signed up for it because I wanted to do something with my diabetes. I want other people to benefit from the surgery and the research, but I also wanted to not have diabetes. I mean, I'm not gonna lie. But it was bonus. And there have been like so many things, like when I started the transplant program, my kidneys were starting to show signs of like protein in my urine, and I don't have any of that. It's all just, everybody that's here in this room is the reason why. The people that donate, the people that support and run, they're the reason why I'm here, they're the reason why I'm still alive, they're the reason why I can still see. And so I think if anybody claps, it should be Robin.
Good. Well, Amy, thank you very, very much. And thank you all for being here, and I would be happy to answer any questions. I'll try. Thank you.